Shalom Bethel family and Chag Sameach. I am recording this video amidst the Chol HaMoed Passover period. That's the time between the first Yontif of Passover and the second Yontif of Passover, when it's still the holiday, but we're not observing it as Yontif, meaning very much like Shabbat. Though you will notice at the second Seder, we started counting the Omer. That is the 49 days between Passover and Shavuot. Today, I'm recording this on Wednesday. It's the fourth day of the Omer, and you can see one of the customs we do during the Omer is not to shave, hence my beard. I wanted to share a little bit about our discussion this past Shabbat, which was also the first day of Passover here at Bethel in the sanctuary. And we talked about matzah. Usually that's what we do on the first day of Passover. We talk about something that we can talk about on the second day of Passover. In this case, I talked about matzah, and I think since we're still deep in the period of eating matzah and probably getting a little tired of it, I thought it would still be an awfully relevant lesson to share with you and a good reminder of why exactly we're doing that. The text I'm going to share I actually received from the Florence Melton School of Adult Jewish Learning, and it was a great collection of texts, and I want to take it, what they sent, and take it even a little further also. So the first texts were provided by Professor Arnold Ehrlich, who came to the United States from Russia in the late 1800s. And he talked about the matzah not as the bread of poverty, as we read in the beginning of the Haggadah, right? Halach ma'anya, this is the bread of poverty, often translated as affliction, but really poverty is a better word. He said, no, matzah is the food of freedom. How do we know? From all these verses in the Torah where it's referred to that way. We have it referred to as the bread of freedom in Genesis a couple times. First, in 18:6, when the three angels come to visit Abraham and Sarah, Abraham tells Sarah, go make ugot, make cakes. Later in Shemot, in the book of Exodus, when we're talking about preparing the unleavened bread, it says ugot matzot, right? Unleavened cakes of dough. So if ugot are what Sarah would make for her guests, right, who just being hospitable, this was the great attribute of Abraham and Sarah, hachnasat orchim, hospitality, this would have to be good bread, not poor bread that you would make. And later in Bereshit, we have the same thing with Lot. When the two angels come to Lot's home, he makes them, it says specifically, matzot, and they ate. Again, Lot, being just like his uncle Abraham, right, wants to give them the best bread, the choicest bread, and that's matzah. Later we see it again with Shmuel. When someone comes to King Saul, she wants to make him a meal fit for a king. And again, in Shmuel 1:28-24, she bakes him unleavened cakes, right, matzot. So again and again, we have matzah being the food of freedom, not the food of poverty, or at least the food of wealth, right? So why then does it become the food of poverty, or is it described as the food of poverty in the Haggadah? And I asked this on Saturday, and we had several ways to speak about it, why it was framed that way in the Haggadah. Before we go into those answers, though, I want to mention also a passage from David Ben-Gurion. When he spoke about matzah, he said, 300 years ago, a ship called the Mayflower set sail to the New World. This was a great event in the history of England and America. Yet I wonder if there's one Englishman who knows at what time the ship set sail. Do the English or Americans know how many people embarked on this voyage, or what quality of bread they ate? Yet more than 3,300 years ago, before the Mayflower set sail, the Jews left Egypt. Every Jew in the world, even in America or Soviet Russia, knows on exactly what date they left, the 15th of Nisan. Everyone knows what kind of bread the Jews ate, matzah. Even today, the Jews worldwide eat matzah on the 15th of Nisan. They tell the story of the Exodus and all the troubles that Jews have endured since being exiled. They conclude this evening with two statements. This year slaves, next year free humans. This year here, next year in Jerusalem, in Zion, in Eretz Yisrael. Says David Ben-Gurion, this is the nature of Jews. So again, we have the matzah being spoken about very differently, right? For David Ben-Gurion, is matzah the bread of poverty or the bread of affliction? Here, in a different way, he's talking about it as the bread of wealth or the bread of prosperity. So we spoke about why does the Haggadah call it the bread of poverty, and later in the Haggadah, actually, we eat it reclining like free people. So I would posit that the bread, the matzah itself, is neither a symbol of poverty or of wealth. The matzah itself is a symbol of freedom. And it shows us, by eating it at the Seder, that both poor people can be impoverished and still have freedom, and wealthy people can be wealthy and still have freedom, which, by the way, you say, oh, that's obvious. But in fact, so often, wealthy people become enslaved to their wealth, or a wealthy nation loses its way from, say, God. The Torah tells us again and again, when you experience wealth, you'll wander from the path of God. The Haggadah is telling us the matzah isn't about poverty or wealth, it's about freedom. So what's the freedom of the matzah? Well, a few things were suggested. What I wanted to share is, I think what we learn from Dr. Ehrlich and what we learn from David Ben-Gurion is that what makes matzah the symbol of freedom? It's that matzah is the bread of story. Right? Through matzah, we tell our story. Whether it's the story of the Bible, whether of Genesis with Abraham, or the story of Shmuel later in the Bible, or the story of the Exodus itself. The matzah is our bread of freedom because it is the bread that marks our story. As David Ben-Gurion adds, for 3,300 years we tell the story of this matzah. We talk about when it was eaten and why it was eaten. And through being able to tell our own story, to frame our own story and own our own story, that is true freedom. It's when we forget our stories that we risk enslavement, that we risk impoverishment. But even if we don't have a lot, when we have our stories, we have something, we have freedom. We live in a world today where people are trying to take other people's stories. People are not listening to other people's stories. People are not owning their own stories, but running from them. And this is a reminder to us as Jews that we are all about owning our story, to tell our stories, to share our stories, not only in telling, but in how we live, in what we eat, in how we come together, whether it's eating matzah or having a Seder. And what do we do when we come together in freedom? We tell our stories. This matzah bread that we are still eating challenges us to remember our story, to own our story, to respond to our story in a real way. And as we come to these final days of Passover, I encourage us all to think about that. What is my Jewish story? How does it relate to the greater Jewish story? Am I really free? Free in my relationship with God, free in my relationship with my family, free in relationship with my belongings even. And what does that mean? When we explore those questions and tell that story, our own story, and share it with each other, and hear honestly and earnestly and with empathy the story of the other, of other people, of other nations, that is when we are truly fulfilling the value of matzah, the value of this bread, the bread of stories, the bread of freedom. May we all go out, learn our stories, tell our stories, and hear other people's stories, and in so embrace this ending of the holiday. And with that, I wish you all a moadim l'simcha. I hope this Chol HaMoed period is very wonderful for you, and a Chag Sameach, and soon to come a Shabbat Shalom as well.